Thanks a lot for joining. My name is Ivan Sajid. I'm one of the co-chair of the Birds Caribbean Seabird Working Group. Just a reminder, sorry, I'm sharing my screen here. In September, we are organizing a workshop to interpret the Caribbean seabird census data. If you want to join, you can go to that link. I'm going to share the link in the chat as well. Oh, I lost it. Anyway, I will share it later in the chat. Actually, here it is. Thanks for from the Convention for Biological Diversity BioBridge Initiative, we have funding to help support travel to Dominican Republic. So we encourage you to apply for travel support. Lisa Sorensen of Birds Caribbean is going to talk a little bit about the NGO, and then we'll start with the webinar. Go ahead, Lisa.
Great. Thank you, Yvonne. So good to see so many people joining in. So just a little background for those of you that may not be familiar with us. Birds Caribbean is the leading regional organization dedicated to the conservation of Caribbean birds and their habitats. Founded in 1988, we are a vibrant international network of scientists, educators, conservationists, birders, and community leaders, all united by a shared mission, which is to, you can go to the next slide, to raise awareness, promote sound science, and empower local partners to build a region where people appreciate, conserve, and benefit from thriving bird populations and healthy ecosystems. So our work spans the entire insular Caribbean, including Bermuda, the Bahamas, and all islands within the Caribbean basin. And with over 60 partner organizations, including NGOs, government agencies, universities, and grassroots groups, we carry out collaborative projects to study, monitor, and protect birds, restore habitats, and engage communities in conservation. Next slide. If you're not already connected with us, we invite you to join us. Sign up for our monthly newsletter, and I'll put these bit.ly links in the chat a little bit later. We would welcome you to join as a member. And we also invite you to join our listserv, where we share lots of, in all of these resources, the newsletter and the listserv, we share updates about current research, conservation work, opportunities, for example, like the Seabird workshop that's coming up, and so forth. So with that, welcome everybody, and big thanks to Jonathan, Gabby, Yvonne, Rhiannon, Farah, and the entire team, the translators, for organizing this workshop today. And I'll let you take it from there, Yvonne.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. All right, welcome everyone to our second webinar with our colleagues at BirdLife International. The first webinar last week was an introduction to the important bird areas and key biodiversity areas, those two programs which are led by BirdLife International. We will share the recording to that webinar soon on the listserv and social media. That will be on YouTube, Birds Caribbean and BirdLife's YouTube channels. Today we're going to see how to implement the policies into practice thanks to case studies from the Turks and Caicos. That would be Rhiannon Austin from the University of Liverpool. Rhiannon has been leading a lot of work in a TCI on monitoring and censusing seabird populations there. We'll also hear from Farah Mukhida from the Anguilla National Trust on how they updated their own key biodiversity areas on the islands. And Jonathan Handley from BirdLife will talk about the Marine Conservation Toolkit that BirdLife has created. So I will let the speakers talk. We will have those three presentations, about 15 to 20 minutes each. And at the end, we'll have a series of questions. Feel free to ask questions in the chat as we go, or keep them for the end if you prefer. You can ask in English or in Spanish. And there is live translation to Spanish. Thank you. Go ahead.
Great. Thanks so much, Ivan. Very nice to see everyone here. Let me just get my screen shared. Okay, so my name is Jono Handley. I work with the BirdLife International Marine Program based out of Cambridge in the UK, and my role in the team is to support partners and others beyond the BirdLife partnership with the sites work with a focus on key biodiversity areas and important bird and biodiversity areas. One of the things that we've been working on in the team is the Marine Megafauna Conservation Toolkit. And obviously these things are the work of many, and I would just like to acknowledge all the teams that made this work possible. There are many, many organizations, and really the toolkit is a culmination of work that started in the early 2010 with partners from Spain, Portugal, and France. There are also a couple of key publications that led to ideas around this toolkit. So feel free to have a look at those and learn a little bit more also. You might be asking yourself this question of another toolkit. Do we need another tool out there to help us do our work? And of course, we thought yes to this question. And this is because identifying these important sites for marine megafauna and knowing how to leverage this important site information to achieve a conservation outcome is complex. We see these maps, but there's a lot of work that goes into them, and getting decision makers to act is not necessarily easy. And so we in the team really wanted to try and help people deal with animal tracking data as our sort of initial starting question. When you have a few animal tracks, you can start to understand what animals are doing. But as you have more and more data, the picture becomes a little bit more complex. And how do you help decision makers navigate this complex world? In this case, we're trying to deliver a series of sites that decision makers can use to prioritize their conservation actions for marine megafauna. And I'll now just play a brief video which will tell you a bit more about the toolkit itself.
To ensure people and nature can thrive in an ever-changing world, we must focus conservation efforts on the most important sites for nature. This can be achieved by recognizing sites of global significance for biodiversity, or key biodiversity areas. However, identifying important sites for marine biodiversity is not straightforward. We need tools to facilitate this so that we can meet the urgent need to scale solutions for nature conservation. The Marine Megafauna Conservation Toolkit supports users to identify key sites for marine species and find solutions for their conservation. The first edition focuses on seabirds because they are data-rich and help us understand patterns of ocean life. Through three main components, the toolkit helps users identify critical sites for species, including supporting users to turn complex animal tracking data into outputs useful for decision makers. Also helps users in identifying effective conservation interventions through case studies curated by the Global Conservation Evidence Team, and helps users understand which mechanisms can support decision makers to act by guiding users through the policy and advocacy opportunities for site-based conservation. Ultimately, the toolkit provides the foundations to recognize important sites for marine megafauna, helping us to prioritize and conserve critical sites for the persistence of biodiversity, from individual sites to national, regional, and global networks. The Marine Megafauna Conservation Toolkit is proudly delivered by BirdLife International and a global network of partners with the support of the Cambridge Conservation Initiative Collaborative Fund.
So there we have it, a little bit more about the toolkit and how it works. And so this toolkit is this interactive online toolkit. And what does that mean? Really, it's sort of an interactive textbook that you can navigate online. You have the different chapters that you can find and review, and it's simply a case of click on a chapter of interest, work through the content. There's R code, there's tools to look at your data, tools to view your data, and hopefully it's a great starting point for project managers as well as practitioners. Like I said, animal tracking data was the start of our thought, the top right panel, animal tracking data assessments. But as we built the toolkit, we realized there was much more that people needed. And for today's talk, I'll highlight three components. Firstly, contribute and help out. We really want this to be a toolkit that the community can grow, build upon, and so input from others would be amazing. In terms of sites, at the moment, we really focus on breeding sites for seabirds, seaward extensions around colonies, and these sort of pelagic offshore sites from tracking data. But we know for animals, we've got migration corridors, we've got non-breeding coastal congregations also, so there's other ways to think about sites. And today we're building on the back of the seabird census across the Caribbean, and the breeding location assessments are still a component of the toolkit that we're developing. So I'll just quickly navigate to the toolkit and give you a sense of what it looks like. So you arrive on the main landing page, which summarizes the toolkit content, and from there you can drive to the website and you can find your chapter of interest and simple summary text, simple bits of R code for those interested. And we have a couple of tools to sort of view and navigate your data also. So play around, have a look, and let us know what you think, please. So those who joined the talk last week would recognize the theory of change. We want to get biodiversity into a favorable conservation status. And in our sites team, we think of this across 6 key steps. Getting the information about species that require interventions, knowing where to act, working out the conservation evidence that's needed, mechanisms to create action, and ultimately getting to decision makers to act. And that helps us form the 3 core components of the toolkit: the technical, the conservation, the policy, and the advocacy. And the seabird census work really forms the critical starting point of this theory of change. So amazing to see the work that has been done. Starting from the policy and advocacy side, I'll just highlight that the toolkit covers a lot of content here. Some of the aspects of the targets that key biodiversity areas relate to, and some of the advocacy tools that BirdLife has developed in the past, as well as more marine-specific opportunities for policy and engagement work. In terms of conservation, we need to know what works when we're conserving species. So we've highlighted the threats that species are impacted by at a global level, and this provides a starting point for decision makers thinking what you might need to look at in particular sites. And we know that protected areas are part of the solution for species conservation, but really we need to know what actions are going to happen at sites, or what need to happen at sites to support species achieving a favorable conservation status. And here we've worked with our partners at Conservation Evidence. We have a really nice tool for looking at different species, different threats, and what you can do to conserve species against particular threats. So we're a bit biased to the technical discussion today, and I'll highlight some of the components that the toolkit covers. Like I said, breeding sites, seaward extensions, and these pelagic or sort of offshore areas. But irrespective of which one of those you're looking at, you generally need to start with some form of abundance estimate. You need a boundary that you're looking at, and the species conservation status. With that information, comparing to global or regional assessment criteria, you can start to see whether or not a site meets a particular set of criteria. Focusing on the offshore sites, so sites that we might identify from tracking data, the simple summary is that we have a tool that was developed over some years. It's been published as an R package. And if you look at the top left panel, you can see all the animal tracks going all over the place. And if you look at the bottom right panel, you can see an area in green, a much smaller area than the overall animal tracking area. And that area in green is the start of the kind of ecological boundary that we might put forward for a key biodiversity area assessment. So the take home is we're not looking at the overall area that the tracks go from the birds. We're looking at this much smaller area, and we have this published method that we work through to try and do this. In terms of seaward extensions, so these are the areas kind of adjacent to breeding colonies, but the marine areas that birds use or move through. Again, there's a number of ways that people can tackle this approach, from simple buffers, buffers masked by bathymetry, the plot in the middle, to more complex methods where we have these density decay functions, more birds closer to the colonies and fewer birds further from the colonies. Now, I just thought I'd highlight in the context of this literature, people talk about foraging radius approaches. We're talking about the seaward extension approach here. The distance metric that you use when you're doing this approach can be different, a maximum, a mean, or some other distance metric, for example, rafting areas for some seabirds. In the context of sites, what we're really trying to promote is a conservative choice when it comes to the metric that you're using here. Sites, and so thinking about this manageability aspect is really key when you're deciding on what metric you use to try and represent an area around the seabird colony. And this is a paragraph of text from a review of UK seabird species. And I think the part in bold is quite nice to highlight. Each metric has its strengths and weaknesses, and it may be appropriate to make use of different metrics at different points in the process. So essentially, work with your stakeholders to clarify your question and the intended outcomes correctly. And for the breeding sites, what you'll see at the moment, if you navigate to the chapter, is a holding page saying how it's a work in progress. And so some of the case studies that we're going to see today will really help us in terms of designing the content that's needed for these parts of the chapters. For breeding sites, I think it's important to recognize that seabirds breed in lots of different types of colonies, or sort of ways you can look at colonies. Looking at some of the petrels in the Caribbean, we know these aren't as easy to find, for example, but the biology of marine birds in chapter 4 nicely summarizes 95% of seabird species are colonial. So we're generally able to think about identifying a site for these species, or for many other species. And last week I highlighted 3 examples, the polygons in blue. 1 seabird species in this multi-part site, 1 seabird species in a single part site, or 1 seabird amongst many others in the single part site. And the main message is a sort of case-by-case consideration that's needed depending on the data and the species in question. Just to talk about reassessments, the toolkit covers a lot towards new assessments, and reassessments are going to be a major part of site work. This is a summary slide, and the key thing is to focus on the bottom row and the last 2 columns. Before comprehensive assessments across countries, we had roughly 10% of countries covered by key biodiversity areas, where the majority of those sites were informed by the bird data from the original IBA criteria. When countries have had the opportunity to do these comprehensive reassessments, the bird sites have often formed this amazing starting point, and the reassessments on average have led to 20% coverage across countries for key biodiversity areas. So last few slides, the toolkit covers a lot. A lot of it focuses on new assessments, but this point in terms of proposing key biodiversity areas, a critical component of this is the consultation with past proposers and navigating the criteria and boundary considerations is very much a part of the process. So with that, thank you so much. There's lots of resources to get you started, and please reach out to myself, Gabby, or Ivan. We'd love to be in contact more. Thank you. I'll stop the share quickly. And then I think we're going towards questions at the end. I'll hand it over to Rhiannon to continue.
Can you see my presentation? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Great. Hi, everybody. So I'm going to take over from Jono, and I'm going to give you an example of some of the work that we've been doing in the Turks and Caicos Islands, where I've been lucky enough to work for the last 3.5 years, to update the IBA network that we currently have in this UK overseas territory. It's a big collaborative project that has involved work from lots of different organizations, including the RSPB, which are leading on a lot of the shorebird work and the iguana work. And I'm running the Seabird project out of the Turks and Caicos Islands. If you're not familiar with this set of islands, it's an archipelago of 40 islands and keys in the Western Caribbean. And it has a combined land mass of around 283 kilometers squared. We have a huge diversity of both marine and terrestrial species there, yet it's undergoing one of the highest rates of new build coastal development in the Caribbean. So there's a lot of challenges that we need to address in terms of conservation of both species and habitats. We have 15 species of seabirds which are resident in the Turks and Caicos Islands, and 13 of these are breeding. And we have possibly some of the largest combined populations of seabirds in the Caribbean. So it's an incredibly important site for seabirds. And we have a huge diversity of habitats within the Turks and Caicos Islands as well, ranging from sandy beaches to mangrove ecosystems to dry forests and shrublands, and then big wetland complexes. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about those in a second. We have an existing IBA network in the Turks and Caicos Islands of 9 IBAs across 2 of the banks. We have both the Caicos and the Turks Bank. These were all designated in 2007, based largely on data that were collected prior to 2005, and most have not been updated since. All of these IBAs were designated as legacy KBAs, which was the process that happened automatically in 2016 when this global standard was introduced. However, before the project that I'm going to show you now, many had never been reviewed. So most of these sites need updating and reviewing. And we started with the existing IBA network that we have, because there is a lot of evidence that many IBAs have features within them and species for which they were not originally designated for, which warrant designation as KBAs. So it's a really good starting point. And then we also undertook surveys in a large number of other sites that weren't part of the existing network. Most of this work has happened under a big Darwin Plus project, which has been running since 2002. And the main focus of this project was seabirds, which is why I'm talking to you today. And we've been surveying over 50 sites over multiple years now. It's involved a huge collaborative effort from local organisations, including the government, the National Trust, the Reef Fund, the RSPB, and also international organisations. And BirdLife International have been working with us to try and undertake this IBA update. And so we've generated a huge database of survey data, population distributions and sizes for 15 species and seabirds, and it's probably one of the largest out there now in the Caribbean. I've just got some nice photos for you there to see the team in action. So the IBA network, we have 6 IBAs on the Caicos Bank, and 3 of these were designated in part because of seabird features. There's the North, Middle and East Caicos Ramsar site, which is a huge area of land. It covers 2 of the big islands in the archipelago. And then we have the East Caicos and Adjacent Areas IBA, which again is a massive site. It's one of the last remaining uninhabited large islands in this part of the world. And there's a lot of work and other Darwin projects is ongoing in this site. And then we have another IBA, which is much smaller and incorporates a number of small keys on the outer edge of the Caicos Bank. Then moving over to the Turks Bank, we have 3 IBAs there as well, which have been designated in part because of seabird features. We have salinas and shores around Grand Turk. We have a creek and shore system on Salt Key, which is one of the big keys off of Grand Turk. And then again, we have a number of small keys, which are called seabird keys on the Turks Bank. And these have some significant populations of seabirds. In the 2007 designation, we had internationally important breeding populations on these islands, on these small keys, sorry. I'm going to quickly talk you through 2 of the examples of these IBA assessments that we've been working on with Gabby and BirdLife, just to give you some examples of some of the considerations and caveats to this approach that we've been facing. So the first is actually 2 IBAs, the biggest IBAs we have, and we've actually decided that we're proposing to merge these sites. So this is work that is based on data from the RSPB, lots of work from the RSPB and also the Seabird project. So these 2 sites incorporate the North, Middle and East Caicos Island complex. So we have 3 islands and we have 2 extensive large-scale IBAs over these 3 islands. The habitat is largely a complex system of wetland habitats with small-scale linked dry land ecosystems and the transition habitats between them. So it's incredibly dynamic and incredibly complex. And there's a huge number of species to think about within this system. The North, Middle and East Caicos Ramsar site was originally designated in 2007 because of a large number of trigger species, including 21 bird species, and 6 of these were seabirds. It had globally threatened species, restricted range species, and a number of water birds and seabirds, which were present in global populations that exceeded 1% of the global population. And then East Caicos and its adjoining areas, 12 bird species were triggers, 6 were seabirds. So lots of important features. Some of the challenges for these 2 sites are that at present, we have a number of different boundaries and levels of protection and designation as IBAs, many of which don't align. So the delineations of the Ramsar site don't actually align with the boundaries of a nature reserve, which is a national nature reserve. And then the IBAs, again, are split, and there's very little understanding of why the boundaries of the 2 IBAs were split as they were. So we're trying to recommend any future delineations that we put forward for our KBA system to be more sensible, essentially. The other issue is manageability. So these areas are huge, large areas that have been set up as IBAs. And we've been trying to think and discuss and assess how suitable they are in terms of long-term monitoring and protection, and what the strategy would be, and whether suggesting ongoing designation as a KBA is the best way forward. So I'm presenting now some of the data from the RSPB. Simon Busuttil, who is a colleague who is the point contact in the Turks and Caicos Islands for the RSPB, has provided these data. And the data are based on a number of surveys which have been undertaken over the last few years. And during the assessments, it's been found that there are 4 species of shorebirds that are present in globally important numbers. So we have short-billed dowitchers, which are a vulnerable species, and we have over 1% of the global population in the North, Middle and East Caicos complex. We have 2 to 4% of the reddish egrets, again, in these islands, and there are near threatened species which have globally declining as resident in the TCIs, but the population for large periods of the year. And lastly, we have the piping plover, which again is a near threatened species. And we have, again, over 1% of the global population in the Turks and Caicos Islands in actually some very constrained clustered areas. So these 4 species alone warrant designation of these sites as a KBA. Then moving on to seabirds again, we've also done a lot of work throughout the islands to assess the seabird populations. And we found that there's one species in particular which is present in large numbers. And I wanted to highlight this species to you because while it doesn't necessarily warrant designation as a KBA, it's not globally important that we think. It's something to highlight because this species is actually data deficient. And I just wanted to mention some of the limitations in terms of the IBA KBA approach at present, where there are large data gaps, which really drives home the need for more data and future surveys so that we can actually make sensible decisions about KBA designation. For the gull-billed tern, they're very difficult to study because they don't nest in large colonies like a lot of seabirds. They're actually quite clustered over large areas, and they will nest either in pairs or very, very small clusters. So they're quite a hard species, and so they are left unnoticed in many places. And at present, there's no global population. It's unknown, and the regional estimate hasn't been updated for a long period of time. But the great news is the shorebirds alone will highlight the fact that there is a need for KBA designation. So hopefully the species will benefit from some of the ongoing management of this site. So what we're doing is we're actually suggesting a merging of these two current IBAs into one. And we are also recommending that this large site, or these two sites, become one KBA. There are also some sites which have been found to be important for some of the shorebird species which weren't included in the original delineation of these sites. So we're extending the boundaries of the existing sites to cover some of these important areas for piping plovers and short-billed dowitchers. You might ask how manageable this site really is, because it's such a huge area of land. And I just wanted to mention, we actually do believe that this site is really suited to large-scale land management. One of the issues we have is these species are actually scattered in low densities over large areas of land. And the areas that they use do seem to change on an interannual basis as well, according to factors such as water levels. So it's been assessed that actually what sites, as individual sites or a network of sites, would be a logistical nightmare from a management perspective, and it would have to be very adaptive. So actually, at present, we are proposing this large area with really robust management plans written into it if it does become a protected system, or it is already protected as a Ramsar site, but if we can extend the protection. Okay, so the second example I'm going to give you is a series of ecologically linked keys, small keys. It's a much smaller site on the edge of the Caicos Bank. They're composed largely of limestone bedrock, of low-lying shrubland. Some have lagoons and others have nice sandy beaches. Beautiful, beautiful areas. This IBA was designated again in 2007. Predominantly because of the large seabird populations that breed in these offshore keys. We have 5 species that were either globally or regionally significant in their numbers, and it also holds regular occurrences of large numbers of water birds, over 20,000 individuals, or it did at the time of designation. Unfortunately, there have been no full-scale surveys undertaken at those sites since 2002, up until we started this project. And there are also a number of small keys nearby this IBA that weren't included in the original designation. And again, it's in a really important site because it is really remote. So there are some manageability considerations and concerns as well. So we've undertaken a massive 3-year data collection effort. We've surveyed all of the seabird populations on these keys. And we've actually found that there are still significant populations of seabirds that use these areas, over 6,700 breeding pairs on an annual basis, which warrants its ongoing designation as an IBA at least, and also as a new KBA. We have over 1% of regional populations of some seabird species just in their own right. However, some of the species level triggers have actually changed. So, for example, initially the brown noddy, there was over 1% of the global population on these islands. There doesn't appear to be anymore. There are smaller numbers. And then on the other end of the scale, we've found some species which weren't included in the original designation, which are present in large, large numbers on nearby keys. So the one I want to mention is the Sargasso shearwater. It was previously known as the Audubon shearwater, which you might recognise. There are small, what we're now calling shearwater keys nearby the other islands within this IBA network that actually host globally important populations of Sargasso shearwaters. So we've undertaken some really extensive survey work during nighttime and daytime over a couple of years now. And using very conservative methods, which include measures of uncertainty, we've found that there's between 5 and 25% of the global population on just a few keys in the Turks and Caicos Islands. Now, I don't believe that there are 25% of the global population of the species. And the reason for that is I believe that the global population numbers are actually massively underestimated. This species is quite difficult to survey, and it's data deficient in a lot of areas. So I believe that the global population needs updating as well. But regardless, if we're using the method that we're using, it's a significant trigger species, which suggests incorporation of these sites into KBA, the KBA assessments. We've gone further and we've actually started tracking the species from the shearwater keys, because we wanted to see whether the islands that they nest on are ecologically linked to the other sites within the IBA network. And these are just a few tracks from a few species of the foraging distributions along the edge of the bank, and they do appear to follow the chain of these islands right down. So they are ecologically linked, which is justification for incorporating new sites and extending the network in the Southern Keys. So again, we are recommending KBA designation for this site with some new additions of new keys that aren't currently incorporated because of the reasons I've just mentioned. And I just wanted to mention another island here that you'll see that's got the big arrow pointing to it. This is Big Amberis. It's another island that isn't being included into this particular site. And it's another good example of some of the considerations when you're doing this kind of work. So Big Amberis is currently not part of the IBA network in the Turks and Caicos Islands. The RSPB have done a lot of work on Big Amberis and have found that it hosts over 2% of the global population of the endangered TCI rock iguana. So it's a hugely important site for rock iguanas, which would warrant its designation as a KBA immediately. It also hosts the largest population of roseate terns in the Turks and Caicos Islands, which would equate to over 1% of the regional population. So again, if you're using the IBA criteria, would warrant designation as an IBA. So we are recommending that it becomes a KBA. The RSPB are leading that charge, but we are not suggesting that it be incorporated into the Southern Keys IBA, even though it's very closely situated to them. And the reason for this is twofold. The first is that it's actually quite ecologically distinct from the Southern Keys IBA keys. The habitats are different, the species it hosts are actually quite different, and because of the endangered conservation status of the iguana, it really needs to be highlighted and managed in a different way. So the management considerations are different because this is an inhabited island and it's a privately owned island again. So there are a lot of different manageability considerations that warrant a separate designation as a KBA in its own right. So in summary, just to give you to show you the 3 sites that I just mentioned, hopefully some of the challenges that we've been dealing with are useful when you're thinking about your own IBA and KBA sites. Again, to summarize the considerations, a lot of the existing IBAs really do need updating, and there's a need to assess their suitability as KBAs. Ecosystems change massively in the Caribbean, as we know. Hurricanes come through, and many of them are sort of in need of desperate update. Another major consideration is how manageable are your sites when you're thinking about the size and the delineations of the sites, particularly for new sites. And then lastly, are your sites ecologically linked, or are they isolated units? And how is that going to work when you're thinking about long-term management plans? This work, it has had a lot of people involved. There's a lot of partners and collaborators. So thank you to everyone that has contributed to it, and thank you for listening. And I think we're having questions at the end. I'll just stop sharing. Over to you, Farah.
Hi, good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much. Thanks, Rhiannon. Really nice presentation. And thank you everyone for having us here today and for allowing us this opportunity to present on some of the work that we've been involved in. So just for some context, if I can work this out. There we go. Okay, so Anguilla lies at the top of the Lesser Antillean island chain, with almost all of our offshore keys lying to the north, except for Anguillita, which is to the west, and it's a really small rocky outcropping. And then we also have Scrub Island and Little Scrub Island just lying to the east. So that's where we are. And then just to tell you a little bit about the Anguilla National Trust, we are a statutory body, so we were established by government, but we are considered non-governmental. But we have a legal mandate to protect, conserve, and promote Anguilla's natural, cultural, and built heritage. And we have 4 main program areas, which include habitat and species conservation, protected areas management, culture and heritage, protection and promotion, and public awareness and stewardship. So as part of our work programs, we've developed a number of biodiversity monitoring programs to help establish baselines and to monitor change over time, especially in response to conservation interventions, including protected areas designation and the removal of invasive species from almost all of our offshore keys, as well as our newly established mainland island, which is at Fountain National Park. So one of our largest, or longest rather, standing monitoring program focuses on our birds, so our wetland, terrestrial, and seabird populations. And we launched our bird monitoring program back in 2005. And since then, we have recorded 86 wetland bird species, 26 terrestrial species, and 15 seabird species. So this data has also helped us to identify important bird and biodiversity areas. And we've gone through several iterations of our IBA network as we've collected and analyzed data and compared results to criteria thresholds. So for example, in 2006, we had 4 sites that were identified as sites of global conservation importance, including Sombrero Island, Dog Island, Scrub Island, and our only protected wetland, which is East End Pond Conservation Area, which is on the mainland. And half of these sites met more than one IBA selection criteria. In 2008, as our bird monitoring program became more established, we once again applied IBA criteria to our wetlands and expanded the network to include 3 additional mainland wetlands, and that included Gray Pond, Long Salt Pond, and Cove Pond. And then we also added another set of offshore keys, Prickly Pear East and West, to the network. But based on the results of our monthly wetland bird monitoring program, we realized that East End Pond no longer qualified or met the criteria. So we removed it from the list of recognized sites. And then 5 years later, between 2013 and 2014, following comprehensive seabird counts on our offshore keys, and this was supported by Birds Caribbean, we undertook yet another review. And we found that a significant number of our wetlands, 11 in total, actually qualified for IBA designation or recognition, along with 1 terrestrial site for the presence of restricted range species. And our 4 previously identified offshore keys continued to meet the threshold criteria. So that gave us 16 IBAs in total. Now, 10 years on, we're overdue for a review. And as part of one of our Darwin Plus and US Fish and Wildlife Service funded projects, which focuses on this particular wetland, which is Road Salt Pond, but also with the help of BirdLife International and the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, we're completely reassessing our IBA network. So our long-term monitoring data has shown fluctuations over time in bird abundance, both on the offshore keys as well as our mainland wetlands, including at least wetlands within species that would have triggered IBA recognition, and all of which were actually seabirds, so our least terns, common terns, and brown pelicans. with one of the IBA criteria being that trigger species numbers should meet criteria thresholds for at least 3 consecutive years. We were finding it more and more difficult to justify individual ponds as being IBAs in and of themselves. So with this current review that we're undertaking, we're actually, or we've decided to look at all of Anguilla's wetlands as a single system. So Anguilla is relatively small, with 25 wetlands, all within very close proximity of each other. And we do know that the birds are moving between those wetlands. So this single system approach makes more sense for us, for at least our mainland situation. For our offshore keys, though, which house both regionally and globally important populations of nesting seabirds, each key will be assessed separately based on their own seabird nesting populations. So we're undertaking this reassessment also within the context of KBAs. So between 2014 and 2016, the European Commission undertook an extensive review of the biodiversity and ecosystems of the Caribbean's 15 EU overseas entities, which included Anguilla. And they established a comprehensive ecosystem profile for each country, dependency, or territory. And they identified 92 KBAs, including 42 terrestrial sites, 50 marine and coastal areas, as well as 43 ecological corridors across the islands within the parts of the region that they had assessed. So in terms of Anguilla, we have 5 KBAs. The first encompasses our offshore islands and our marine parks. The second focuses on the eastern side of the mainland, and it also includes Scrub Island and Little Scrub. Our third are our wetland ponds and the existing IBAs. And then the fourth is the forested areas and bat caves. And then finally, we have marine areas that lie outside of our marine park system. So our review of IBAs therefore also requires a review of at least some of our KBAs. And as we move towards aligning these efforts with BirdLife International's direction as it relates to IBAs and KBAs, we will move away from IBA designation towards KBA identification. And so to this end, we've started once again reviewing our bird data, focusing now on the results of our last 7 and especially our last 4 years of our monitoring program and assessing which species could potentially meet KBA thresholds. So starting with our mainland IBAs and with the help of Gabby and Louise, both who are here today and are part of the Seabird working group, we've been looking at species that had previously triggered IBA designation and comparing those IBA thresholds with KBA thresholds. And of the 9 species that had previously met IBA criteria, which considers regional population sizes, none of them actually met the KBA 1% global population threshold. So, and that was even when considering all of Anguilla's mainland wetlands as a single entity. So we decided to expand our assessment to include other species that occurred in relatively high numbers across the Anguilla mainland and found that our island-wide lesser yellowleg population, with its newly downlisted status from least concern to vulnerable, now meets that 0.2% threshold, which applies to threatened species. And so this enables designation of Anguilla's mainland wetland system as a KBA. Now, just to note that these numbers represent the highest number of lesser yellowlegs recorded in a single month during the identified year. But our yellowlegs are migratory. So while the species meets the threshold based on that single month total, it's likely that the number is higher and it doesn't really represent the actual total number of individuals. So it's likely that birds from the previous month or months might have flown on, and so new ones would have arrived. And we'd expect this to be the case, especially during the spring and fall migrations when birds are moving through Anguilla at the beginning or to and from their breeding and wintering grounds. So this summer, using the results of our 2022 Seabird census data, we'll be undertaking a similar review of our offshore key IBAs and KBAs. And preliminary numbers continue to suggest that sombrero, dog, and the prickly pears would meet KBA thresholds, but scrub would not, based on seabird numbers alone. But the presence of other biodiversity on the offshore key, for example, endangered Anguilla bank racers, may serve as KBA trigger species. But we do have to conduct population assessments just to verify that. So in terms of next steps, we do need to complete the online KBA form for Anguilla's mainland wetland network, as well as for at least 3 of our 4 offshore keys. We'll also be undertaking Lesser Antillean iguana surveys on prickly pear east, and that may also serve as a trigger species for KBA designation. And then later in the year, or hopefully sometime next year, we'll aim to conduct Anguilla bank racer surveys on Scrub Island, depending on the outcome of the latter, we'll seek to have scrub re-recognized as a KBA. But we'll also continue to have discussions with BirdLife about how regional criteria, similar to that which have been established for the IBAs, may be integrated into the KBA assessment process. Because we feel like that by looking only at global populations and their corresponding thresholds, we're underestimating the value of our islands in the region for our resident and migratory birds. And this could have implications when we're trying to make the case nationally for protected area designation, but also regionally and internationally when we're pursuing funding opportunities to support critical conservation interventions. So that's a very brief summary of the work that we've been doing. So I'm done, and I think there's probably time for questions.
Thank you, Farah. Very interesting presentation. We do have time for questions. There was one in the chat that was directed to Rhiannon. I don't know if you saw it, Rhiannon. I can read it. By Cecilia Tovar. Cecilia would like to know what are the main challenges you're faced during the reassessment process of the sites and applying the KBA criteria.
Yeah, good question. Major challenges. I mean, I think we just have so many species to survey for us. We have so many sites. Some of these IBAs have like 10 to 15 sites within them. And some of those sites, individual islands, have 9 species on them. So in various different habitats, and there's various different monitoring approaches that you need to apply to different species. So it's just been a massive effort. And I think survey effort has been a lot more than we originally anticipated it would be. And I think the other issue, which I was talking to Jonathan about earlier, is that some of the sites, and it's something that Farah just mentioned as well, some of the sites, they would still be designated as an IBA based on regional populations, but they don't warrant designation as a KBA based on global populations. Yeah. And so there's, I guess, I don't know that Jono has mentioned the regional KBA criteria that they're trying to start up, but at the moment the KBAs are just global, so there's risk of the sites being kind of downgraded in terms of conservation efforts because of that. So it's about still recognizing the importance of populations that are regionally important and not forgetting that. I think it's one of the big things to remember.
Which is what we just saw with Farah and Anguilla.
Exactly, yeah.
I guess, Farah, I'll ask you the same question. What were the challenges you faced, if you face any?
I mean, Anguilla's pretty small. It's not as extensive as TCI in terms of all of the different islands that need to be assessed. So, and they're fairly accessible enough to conduct the surveys that we need to do. So we're lucky that we're able to do that. We also have a phenomenal amount of data to draw upon when we're looking at whether or not species are meeting criteria. But it goes back to that what Rhiannon was saying and what we ended the presentation on, which was our islands are on the smaller side, but it doesn't mean that they're not important. And so when we're just looking at our KBA thresholds, some of them are downgraded and they wouldn't be recognized. So I think having that regional criteria integrated into KBA designation in some way or another would be really helpful. But it also goes back to what Rhiannon was saying in her presentation, which was some of those species haven't been assessed properly at the regional or global level. So we don't actually know what targets we're supposed to be trying to meet. So, yeah.
And so that's more a question for Jono, but if there is a risk of losing an IBA designation because of new numbers that don't meet the criteria, the thresholds, is it better for conservationists not to do censuses, to just keep what they have already, keep those IBAs and just not do anything? It's not a real question, but is there a way, like, our IBA is going to be sunset at some point, and so there is actually a push to do censuses to get numbers on KBAs. And I see that Gabby has and Sophie have their hands up.
I can start with a comment, but I'd also welcome any input from Gabby because she's been working with you guys a lot. Take homes for me is that it's important to talk amongst the KBA community about the regional KBA criteria. We are seeing other national, so KBA national coordination groups in other countries developing their own KBA regional criteria, but currently in the global standard, KBA regional criteria haven't been agreed upon. And the way those have been working in other countries is typically using the global criteria and defining a region. So Canada being the good example, which obviously is a completely different scale to the Caribbean, and using 1% thresholds, for example, at a Canadian level, as opposed to a global level. Ivana, you asked like a very good question. You know, should we not be doing monitoring? I feel like, of course, we should be doing monitoring to understand what's going on at these sites. Within BirdLife, we've been thinking about ways to show sites that might be delisted so that we also have a record of those. But I think from the comprehensive assessment slide that I showed also, that's been one of the real, I guess, great things that has happened through the KBA process. Generally speaking, the bird sites, which were assessed against some of the regional IBA criteria, have been this fantastic starting point to then identify other species at sites which would trigger criteria. So actually across a country, the pattern has been to see more sites be identified rather than less sites.
Yeah. Gabby?
Thank you. I'm going to switch to Spanish now to answer your question, Ivan. Definitivamente es importante hacer los monitoreos, como decía Jono, para entender qué está pasando con las poblaciones, y las reevaluaciones de las IVA también son súper importantes y urgentes hacerlas, no solo porque los datos que de muchas de esas tienen ya algunos años, entonces necesitamos entender si la población sigue teniendo esos números en el lugar, sino porque también en algunos casos hemos visto en los ejemplos en los Andes tropicales que muchas de estas IVAs fueron designadas desde la información que tenían disponible en ese momento y trazadas sobre un mapa y no en el lugar preciso. Entonces, hubieron muchas divas que fueron o delistadas o redefinidos sus límites porque no estaban en el lugar correcto. Entonces, hacer los monitoreos sí, nos va a permitir, por un lado, esto, tener más claridad qué pasa con las poblaciones y saber exactamente dónde están. Y en los casos en los que no hay disponibilidad de información, porque no hay censos suficientes, porque no se puede acceder al sitio con facilidad, pero por el conocimiento de los expertos se sabe que es un sitio importante. Hemos estado recomendando en esos casos tal vez no hacer la reevaluación en este momento y esperar a tener esos datos y hacer unos censos más exhaustivos para poder tener esos datos que nos permitan calificarle al sitio como una KBA. Entonces, como que dejamos en pausa algunos sitios, de esta manera no desaparecen del mapa y nos damos este tiempo para confirmar si realmente es un sitio que sea globalmente o regionalmente importante y así como que jugamos un poco con este tema de los criterios.
Yeah. Sofía?
Sí, yo tenía una pregunta, quería más bien hacerla a los tres y es preguntarles qué opinan acerca del involucramiento de otros actores en el proceso de designación de las KBA. Por ejemplo, el gobierno, también gente de la academia o del sector científico. ¿Qué opinan de que varios actores de diferentes frentes se involucren en este proceso?
You all get the translation to English speakers?
I did,
Who wants to answer?
yes.
Go ahead, Journal, if you want.
So involvement of stakeholders of a program that's going to involve key biodiversity areas or IBAs. We have what's called these national coordination groups. And so these would be groups of people that span academia, conservation, public, locals, and ideally government individuals. And what's really valuable about this is that you have all the people who understand the site themselves, what species are there, the numbers that are there, but equally you have all the people that are going to use that information to make decisions, and I guess that have the ability to make decisions sometimes. And if those people are involved in the process from the very beginning, then when the information is released, then they're prepared to use it and can make the decisions in the best possible way when the data is released. And yeah, I'm not sure, Rhiannon and Farah, how you've been able to involve, I guess, people from beyond the scientific community in your assessments also.
So I'll be honest, most of our work is conducted by the National Trust. We do involve volunteers, and they can include government, individuals, and members of the public, but the work is really driven by the National Trust. And then we share results and have those more open discussions when we move forward with the process. But yeah, I guess in an ideal situation, it would involve everyone, but I think everyone just sort of has their own major focal areas, and this happens to be the National Trusts.
And I think the ideal situation, it's ideal for a reason. But for me, at least, one of the amazing strengths of the KBA process is that once this data has been curated, stored, managed, and is publicly accessible, it lives on beyond the length of any single project. And so people like at the Anguilla Trust, year on year, you can go back to that resource. And as opportunities arise with decision makers, you can say, well, here's the evidence, here's the data. You're not having to dig out an old paper or an old report from someone. You have this well-curated resource that you can use in those conversations over time. Sorry, Rhiannon, did you want to jump in also?
Yeah, just in TCI. I mean, it's actually been a collaborative effort to collect the data. So we have some of our survey team, we have the National Trust are involved and the Department of Environment and Coastal Resources. So the government, they come out and we have some of their members of staff helping to collect data. So it's also about building skills and long-term population monitoring programs. And then one of the main sort of outputs is that we meet and we discuss. The government's been, and the trust have been actively involved in kind of the development of the outputs of the work. So, and one of the outputs of the Seabird project is that it will lead to the development of site management plans so that the data are actively contributing to real on the ground protection. Now, I know that's again, best case and these things take time, but we're hoping that will be the outcome eventually. So, and the project includes representatives from all those organizations. So
yeah, awesome. Gabby, did you want to reflect on any of the experiences with the recent projects across the Americas in terms of involvement with all the different stakeholders?
Sí, bueno, los proyectos que hicimos con Andes tropicales, desde el inicio del proyecto se informó y se involucró a varios actores, desde los gobiernos nacionales, los gobiernos regionales, la sociedad civil. En algunos países también tuvimos un interés, un involucramiento de los grupos indígenas. Y lo que vimos fue varias cosas interesantes. La una es que, por ejemplo, los gobiernos están mucho más interesados y colaboran mucho más hacia el final del proyecto cuando ya tenemos resultados que son visibles, porque finalmente son esos resultados los que los gobiernos van a utilizar para sus tomas de decisiones y priorizaciones. Entonces, creo que es bueno tomar en cuenta eso como para tampoco agotar nuestros esfuerzos de involucrar a ciertos actores en las primeras etapas del proyecto. Y más bien es reforzar hacia el uso de los resultados como las herramientas. Esto en términos de los gobiernos y los grupos locales y grupos indígenas. Fue para entender cuáles son los intereses de ellos en la designación de KBA y cómo ellos pueden utilizar a la KBA para sus propios intereses que son completamente diferentes a los nuestros y a los del gobierno. Entonces adaptamos también un poco el acercamiento y los discursos para tener el apoyo de esos grupos y fue muy bueno. En Ecuador tuvimos un involucramiento muy interesante de los grupos amazónicos que apoyaron en la toma de datos y también nosotros desarrollamos en conjunto documentos informativos de cómo las KBA pueden ser utilizadas para la defensa del territorio, por ejemplo. Entonces, sí ha sido un ejercicio muy interesante y hemos aprendido también como que en qué etapas de los proyectos vale la pena dirigir nuestros esfuerzos, para qué grupos. Y al final hemos tenido unos resultados muy buenos en donde las KBA están siendo utilizadas por diferentes actores para sus propios intereses.
Great, thank you. Charlotte has had her hand up for a very long time. Charlotte Boyd, if you're still there and you still want to ask your question, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Actually, it wasn't so much a question, but really a comment coming back to the discussion about regional criteria. So first of all, yep.
I know who you are, and I'm not sure if everyone else knows who you are, but maybe would it be worth saying briefly who you are? Because I feel like there's a few questions that I'd love to discuss with you on this topic also. and you've got lots of wise experience and input.
Okay.
Sorry.
So thank you. Yeah, my name is Charlotte Boyd. I was previously the chair of the committee, the Standards and Appeals Committee, which is responsible for developing the guidelines for how to apply the KBA criteria. And then with Jono, I am co-chair of the KBA Marine KBA working group. And I recently moved to BirdLife South Africa, where I am the Regional Conservation Program Manager, and one of our key responsibilities is supporting identification and mapping of KBAs in Southern Africa, and potentially further in other countries in Africa. So on the regional criteria, and I'm also a member of the KBA Technical Working Group. So as Jono mentioned, there has been lots of discussions about regional criteria. I think it's unlikely that these will be finalized in the near future, but I do think it's really important that we do as much testing as we can of potential approaches to applying to identifying regional KBAs. There are many different ways we could do it. We could define a specific geographic area and say, well, we're just going to apply the global criteria to the populations within that geographic area. We can look at identified regional subpopulations or subspecies. So if you have a flyway and there's a population that's known to use that flyway, and we have estimates of the population size for that, we can apply that approach. There are various different ways that we can slice the cake, and I'm sure we are starting to think about regional criteria for birds in South Africa, and already just at the very beginning of the process, we can see, oh, here are a bunch of questions. We're going to need guidelines on this, and we should test what the options are. So I would definitely encourage, given you've got all these amazing data sets and all these amazing people who know these data sets well, definitely encourage you to kind of look at how you might identify regional KBAs so that when we get to the point of actually developing guidelines for regional KBAs, we can look at that work and use that to guide decisions. Definitely when we look at the KBA standard, the criteria that are going to stand the test of time are those that were well tested before they were published in the KBA standard. And some of the more challenging ones, the ones that couldn't be tested very well before the KBA standard was developed. In the meantime, if you have a site that you believe is important at the regional level, but it's not meeting any of the global criteria for birds, then if this hasn't been said before, I would definitely recommend looking to other biodiversity, especially on small islands. We may find that there's, other taxonomic groups that have more are characterized by greater geographic restriction, where we do have potential global triggers. So look to those to ensure that site is recognized as globally important. But then I do understand the need to, if the site is regionally important for a particular species, that you do want to get that information documented in some. And it can always be included in the other biodiversity section of the global KBA fact sheet. So hopefully that's a useful contribution. And I think we'll be hearing a lot more about regional KBAs. There's a lot of demand for that, especially to recognize regionally important sites for sort of species with broad global distributions and large global population sizes that maybe breed or whatever in specific locations, but none of those meet the global criteria. So thank you.
Thank you, Charlotte. Yeah, it's
thanks
great
so much, Charlotte.
to mention other taxa, especially because we, the Seabird Working Group, are organizing these webinars, but seabirds may not be the best example of meeting criteria or being triggered species, just because in the Caribbean we have only one, maybe two species that are endemic seabird species. But as Farah is doing with other taxa, that really makes sense for triggering KBAs. Are there any other questions, pressing questions from the audience?
Just going through the chat, Ivan, trying to work out.
Yvonne, I have a quick question if I can jump in.
Go ahead.
Okay, so just to clarify with the experts, if you have, if we know, for example, that one wetland on an island is not going to harbor enough species, numbers, and so forth to meet the criteria, it is valid to, say, combine several wetlands or all the wetlands on the island to meet the criteria and have that area designated as an IBA, KBA?
I think the ecological connectivity component is key.
Yeah.
Generally, those wetlands are connected in some way, shape, or form. And if you can justify that, then that's a great starting point to say that those sites are ecologically connected. If they're completely separate wetlands not being used by the same species or anything like that, that's when I'd say it becomes a little bit harder to merge them all into one.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, that's good to know because, yeah, as we know, in many islands, there are a number of small wetlands, but we believe that, for the most part, they form like a network or a complex, and birds do move between them, although we might not have hard data on some of this, but that is the case, I think, for many wetlands on islands. And I'm thinking, for example, of Barbados, where we're working right now, where there are these shooting swamps that are important for migratory shorebirds. And thankfully, there's a trend for these shooting swamps to be closing down the shooting and more turning into refuges, which is great. But like one site by itself might not be a IBA, KBA, but certainly a few of them would qualify with the numbers that they have moving through. So that's good to know because there is interest there in having these wetlands designated as IBAs, KBAs to help with conservation of the sites, to get government support and so forth. And, these international designations can be really important for that.
Awesome. I think that's sort of one of those example sites we saw, that sort of multi-part site kind of demonstrates how sometimes you have, on the map, it looks like a separate bunch of sites, but really they're one unit.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Thanks for clarifying.
Awesome.
All right, I think we may have reached the end of the discussion.
Can I jump into one question to Rhiannon? Sorry.
Last question.
Last question. Rhiannon, in your first example, where you had two separate sites, if you had never seen those data and you were starting from scratch, what do you think you would have done in terms of delineating a boundary?
Based on the combined survey data for the shorebirds, if it was just for a seabird species, it would be different. The gull-billed terns we found all nest in brackish sort of saline ponds, which are away from the coast. They're quite unusual tern species. So that would be quite easy if we were just looking to protect them. But the other shorebird species, and the RSPB led a big cross-country survey last year for the American flamingos, and they're distributed widely. So I think it would, I don't think it would be too different from what it is. I mean, maybe slightly, but those species combined, it would be really, I think it, as I said in the talk, it would be really, really difficult to highlight the hotspots because of the way that they behave and the way that their movements change throughout interannually.
Yeah.
But I'm working predominantly on seabirds. So I think Simon's not here anymore. I would be interested to hear his opinion on that as well, because he's been focusing more on the shorebird data, which is one of the big trigger features for those sites. East Caicos is, as I said, probably lends itself to large scale management because it's an uninhabited island at the moment. It's one of the biggest uninhabited wild spaces still in this part of the world. And I mean, also to say that the Ramsar site is, I think it's the biggest Ramsar site in the UK inventory. So there's justification there as well for large scale protection. So, and that's been in place for a while. So yeah, I'm not sure I would, it's a challenge. They're challenging islands to protect. I mean, the other issue is that things are changing in the Turks and Caicos Islands quickly. It's massive development. And at the moment, it's starting now in on the north coast of North and Middle Caicos. But a large areas of North and Middle Caicos are wetlands that are uninhabitable at the moment. So I think the fact that those sites are quite wild means that they can be managed in different ways.
Awesome, thanks.
All right, lots of discussions. Reminding you that we are having a workshop in September in Santo Domingo and Dominican Republic to work on the Caribbean seabird census data and also take steps to designate or to work on designating KBAs and IBAs based on those data. So those discussions will happen at the workshop as well. So that was our second and last webinar with our colleagues at BirdLife on the KBA program. Thanks a lot, Gabby and Jono, for taking the time to talk to us and present the great program. Thank you today to Rhiannon and Farah, and thanks again to Heather and Erica for translating to and from Spanish. Really very important to have these translations. I don't think I have anything else to say. We will post the recordings on Birds Caribbean's YouTube channel in the coming days, and I think BirdLife is going to share it on their channels as well. So these webinars will be available to watch there. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Great job. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Gracias.
Bye.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.